Hey, everybody. This is the You're Doing Great Mom podcast, and I am Dr. Marianne Shiozawa. This is episode 31. So why did you... Most people, I think, would...
Stupidity.
Okay. But no, seriously, why... People were...
Stupidity.
That's just a little clip in this episode with my husband. He has just finished his port book. He spent the last 10 years researching and writing his book on vintage port. And it's a really impressive book. And I just thought it'd be a really good idea to have him on my podcast because it's a little different. But people have really enjoyed my episodes with my husband, and I just thought it'd be really fun. Here is my husband, Julian Wiseman, and I having a conversation about port and wine and his book, Port Vintages. Enjoy. So I've had requests to have you on regularly.
Excellent. It's always good that a wife is told by her friends that her husband is fantastic. That's got to be a good result.
Okay, well, they didn't really say it in those words, but...
Oh.
They did say that they loved hearing us together.
Excellent.
Okay.
I'll settle for what little I can get.
And I thought it would be a really good idea to do this episode because for the last 10 years, I have suffered and been tortured watching you write this book on port vintages. So I've discovered a lot of new things about the book and vintage port and your history, and I think it's really interesting. So my question is, why did you spend the last 10 years of our marriage writing this damn book?
Well, would you rather have had me spend it with you? I mean, would you want your husband that much sitting in your lap the whole time? Hey, come on, wives listening in. I mean, husband has a totally safe hobby that doesn't involve killing himself, killing anybody else, or doing inappropriate things. Pretty good result. Maybe that's not the answer you wanted.
No, you got a point there. Okay, carry on.
Okay, let's go back to when I was 14. My father used to have about half a bottle of red wine most nights. A very light drinking habit. And he'd open the bottle and he'd pour a little in the wine glass. He'd hold the wine glass carefully, sniff carefully, look, taste carefully. With the absolute certainty of a 14-year-old, well, I knew everything then, absolutely everything. With the certainty of a 14-year-old, I told him that all his wine tasted the same. I was allowed a fraction of a glass most dinners, and they all tasted the same, and he was just faffing around. I was 14, cut me a little slack. Okay, he says. He goes and opens a second bottle, very unusual for him to have two bottles side by side, pours a second glass and gives me two small glasses of red wine. One of these was matured in oak, and one was matured mostly in steel, he said. Which is which? So, mimicking father, swirling the wine, putting my nose in it, smelling carefully, tasting carefully. Eventually, again with the certainty of a 14-year-old, I tell him it's this one that was matured in wood. Correct, he says. So they're not the same. Ooh. 14-year-old. Even 14-year-old me could see that this was... I'd been snookered on this one. Mm-hmm. It was quite impressive. So let's move forward about a year and a half, and my father had a friend coming round for lunch on a Sunday, and he'd opened a Barolo. Now, Barolo is a big, heavy, strong, powerful red wine made from Nebbiolo grapes. Fantastic. It's good, great table wine.
It's Italian, right?
It's Italian.
That's one of his favourites, actually.
Well, it's one of my favourites.
Really?
Yeah, as a non-fortified wine, if you want plain table wine rather than a fortified wine, it's big. Big is a great word in my wine vocabulary. Delicate is I'm going to have to pretend to like this.
What's delicate? A rosé?
Right. I very rarely drink non-sparkling white wine.
Right. I know that.
Unless you count Sauterne, again, it's big and sweet, or Madeira, which is fortified. Mm-hmm. Or you could just maybe sneak sherry into the category, depending on your preferences. But again, they're
big wines.
Delicate wine. Well, go away. Okay. Uh-oh. So he's serving this Nebbiolo and pours me a small fraction of a glass. And I'm loving it. So I help myself to a bit more. And then I help myself to a bit more. And then I get a hand slap or a verbal equivalent of, no, it's for me and his friend. No more. I was somewhere when I was 15. The following birthday, I got given a case of Terror of the Barolo 1980 with an instruction that I was to drink it around the time of my 21st birthday. Excellent 15th birthday present. Teaches a child a very important skill. Patience. Mm-hmm. This was a birthday present for which I had to wait 6 years. It's actually a very good birthday present. And I knew I really liked it because that summer I had not been allowed to have a decent amount. Lordy knows what the 15-year-old me thought was a decent amount. Okay. So move forward to starting at Cambridge, where I read maths.
Wait, hang on. Pause for a second. I didn't know you liked Barolo. I mean, I knew...
It's very important that a husband have secrets from his wife. The secrets can't be too naughty. It can't be too many of the blonde 20-nothing-year-olds. But some secrets are probably good. One's out of the bag 14 years into the marriage.
I just don't... I mean, I assumed, because I know it's a big wine, but we don't really drink that much Barolo. I know it's an expensive wine. But...
The clue is in the question.
I didn't know you really love it. I didn't know that was... I didn't know about the story. Okay. Well, you learn something every day.
She's obviously female. Men don't learn things every day.
No, that's true. Okay, so fast forward to Cambridge University.
Cambridge. To welcome you to the university, there was what's called a matriculation dinner, at which was served port. I was too young and stupid then. I was older than when I was 14, but then I knew everything. By the time I got to 19, I was a bit wiser, and I knew that I was a lot less wise. It's part of wisdom. And I didn't have the wit to note down which port it was, but I suspect from what was in the cellar that it was a 1970. Great vintage, now approaching the end of the best part of its life, but even now shows nicely, and it was young and full and fantastic. It was a big port.
So this was 1995.
1987 I was drinking this. I'm an old fart.
Oh, I'm sorry. It was 1987.
Yes.
Okay, so 1987 you were drinking a 1970 vintage port.
Yes, it was 17 years old.
Okay.
Just at the start of its drinking window. I would now think that's a bit too young for it, but it's sold port to me. And I knew then that port was the drink for me. There was a cellar. Undergraduates were allowed to buy a very small number of bottles from the cellar. I think it was one bottle of decent vintage port per term. So I wrote a slightly grovelling letter to the wine fellow, whose name escapes me, who had formal charge over the cellar. Sorry, slightly out of order. I spoke to the cellarman. I found out what was in the cellar. They had Taylor 55. They had Taylor 63.
Oh, wow.
They had Taylor 60.
For the record, that's, from my knowledge, that's pretty damn good.
Good stuff. Port. Now, in January 88, when I'm discovering this, 55 was not an old port. It was in its young 30s. Great age to drink port. I would now think of 55 as an old port, 60-something years old. But at the time, it was a port of the right age to drink port. They should have been getting through their 55s about then. Fellows only, not allowed to mere undergraduates. So I wrote a letter to the wine fellow saying that I'd like to learn about port, and that I'd really like to buy from the cellar one of each of, and I listed the various goodies I wanted. Please, so, two things. One, may I be allowed to buy one of each of these for tasting? And two, would you be willing to join us to guide us through and teach us? Grovel, grovel, brown nose.
So how old is this guy?
I don't know.
What is a fellow?
He is one of the resident academics at the college.
Oh, okay. So they're like a professor.
Well, professorships are done by departments, and fellows are done by colleges. And the way the university interacts with the colleges is moderately complicated, and I'm not entirely qualified to comment on it. But resident academic will suffice for our argument, who had one of his responsibilities at the college was the very minor bureaucratic task of looking after the cellar. Okay. There was a cellarman to actually move bottles around. Not that they need much moving. But to make decisions about purchasing and drinking fell to him. And he did exactly the response I wanted. I have instructed Mr. Poulter that you may buy one of each of those, £20 each. They used to sell port to undergraduates and to fellows at replacement cost. That is, they would sell me a 55 with what it cost them to replace it with an 85. Because the time in the cellar was free to them. Some modern finance theory would argue that their pricing structure could have been different, but as an undergraduate, I was entirely happy with this arrangement. And he said, "No, I don't wish to attend your tasting." Splendid. Didn't have some old fart being boring. Instead, I invited 5 friends, and I said, "Here's the rules. I'm splitting the cost. No, I don't know what the cost will be. I'm splitting it. I'll tell you in the morning after. Black tie, my room, 7 p.m. So we went to college dinner at 6. So we'd eaten, and we had 6 decanters of port. 6 of us, and so I needed 36 glasses. Where do I get 36 glasses? I traipsed around buying glasses. I bought a set of a dozen glasses.
This was your first port tasting?
I bought a set of a dozen identical glasses at the Oxfam shop in Cambridge. They were quite small, but it meant that 2 people could have 6 glasses, all of which were the same. Their glasses didn't need to be the same as mine, but for each port, they needed to... It's all washed and prepared in advance.
And you're 20...
I'm
21.
19 at this time.
You're still... you're still 19. Oh my
gosh.
No,
I'm not 19 anymore, my love. I haven't been 19 for a while. Right, so... I managed to scrabble together 36 glasses. I borrowed some decanters from the college, so I got 6 decanters. I did the whole thing. We had a splendid time. No one had refused an invitation to that. I'd only invited 5 friends, and no one ever refused one ever again.
Do you still know these 5 friends, or are you still in contact with these 5 friends?
Without naming them, we went to the 50th birthday of one of them a few months ago, at which was another. A particular good friend of mine from university didn't start at university until 1 year after me, so he didn't come to that event. I'm not really in contact with another one. Occasional contact with him. So
you're still sort of...
The answer is
okay.
Yes, some, a bit, some, and no, some. I mean, it's not an unusual answer 30-odd years later. So
you had this port tasting in your room?
In my room, yeah.
Which is how...
It's smaller than this room, but... There's
like a dorm room. It's basically a dorm room.
It was a room big enough to have a bed and a desk at which one did work, and I swept everything off the desk and put it on shelves and cupboards, and put the desk in the middle of the room and borrowed chairs from places, and 6 of us did an absolutely splendid port tasting from 55 to...
You guys must have gotten wasted.
It was only a bottle of port each.
Yeah, and you're all 19 years old. It's not the liver that you have now.
No. My lovely wife is American, where the legal drinking age is 21. The legal drinking age in the UK then was, in practice, if you looked about
16?
Well, formally it's 18. But if you look about 16, you were probably all right.
Oh, so you've been drinking quite...
So this was
since...
not my first ever alcohol by some margin.
Jesus.
Okay, so where are we? So I did a number of these tastings at university. I wasn't organised enough to keep a proper tasting log, as I should have, and didn't. There was a learning process in life, and that's part of it. When I left university, I had a little period where I didn't drink much port in the mid to late 90s. And then I resumed again with gusto just at the turn of the millennium. And started to host port tastings again for I thought they were the bee's knees, the tastings I then hosted. There'd be 6 ports from one vintage and 4 from a nearby vintage, and 3 of the shippers would be in common between the 2. I thought it was the bee's knees. Then I met my current bunch of port chums, and I realised that my port tastings were rather good, light drinking, entirely satisfactory, but the level of any degree of self-satisfaction would have been misplaced. And not long after meeting them, I met a couple of them early, but then there was a sort of en masse, and we became a crowd. Even though I was living abroad, I was part of it. They could tell I was one of them, and I could tell they were just like me, a bunch of nutters. So we were arranging to be held in October 2008, a Coburn tasting. Maybe I should say something about Coburn. One of the big houses from the 1850s to the middle 1900s. Generally the most expensive port brand. Very splendid reputation. Then it passed into corporate hands and started getting passed down corporate hands as companies had these great ideas and great plans for it, and then got hold of a port house and realised they knew nothing, and then would try to implement some cost saving in the hope of making some money, and then they'd sell it on again. And it went through a bunch of corporate hands, and it fell from being one of the great brands to being a brand that our grandfathers liked. These things have a history. Indeed, it's fair to mention that it has since been bought out by one of the largest family port companies and is being revived in grand style. They are looking after the vineyards as they should be looked after. They've fixed their winemaking problems, and Coburn has gone from being not actually very good 20 years ago to being one of the big names.
Once again.
I don't think it is yet as good as the Symington's other big brands, Graham and Dow.
So Symingtons
are a bunch of cousins who have been in the port trade. They're not really newcomers. They've been there since the 1870s.
Okay.
It's a small part of Portugal where families pass things down. Someone had a bottle of 1908. Not a shabby thing to be opening in 2008. Far older than anything I had. Mm-hmm. And we had quite a few others. 1927. Now, the non-port aficionados among your readership might not know that 27, along with 70, probably the top two vintages of that century. 27 was magnificent, huge volume, which is unusual in a good vintage, and fantastic quality. Mm-hmm. We had a horizontal of 27s last December. Mm-hmm. Rather decadent luncheon. 8 of us sat round and had 8 bottles of 1927 port. Not bad in the middle of December. Not at all bad. Mm-hmm. And they were still showing well, age 90. So it was a fantastic year. So we had an 08, we had a 12, we had a 27, and a bunch of other oldsters. Well, if we're going to do that, we ought to have them all.
So there was...
You can't faff around being incomplete. Now,
how many of you were there?
14.
14.
14 is a standard number, 75 centilitres in a modern bottle, with a bit of Angel's share, as some of them are very old bottles.
What is an Angel's share?
The bit that evaporates.
When it sits in the bottle.
It's a whiskey term. Fill a barrel of whiskey with... Well, you fill a whiskey barrel with whiskey... Mm-hmm. It evaporates slowly. And the evaporation loss is the Angel's share, because the Angels get to drink it.
And is that applied to the whole wine industry?
So the term has spread from whiskey to be more general.
Okay.
I'm using it in that sense. So you might have a tiny bit of loss in the bottle. You will have a tiny bit during decanting, just filter papers, funnels. So you're left with a bit over 70 centilitres. Mm-hmm. 14 ways is a 5 centilitre glass each. It's enough for a taste. It's enough for a reasonable taste, but it's not over generous. Quite often you're thinking, actually, I'd want a second glass to taste that more carefully. So 14 is a hard rule we've imposed on the maximum size of a tasting. Mm-hmm. Exceptions would be made for a magnum tasting, where naturally the bottles are bigger. Magnums are better than singles because the bottles are bigger. It's not complicated. So we had in a bunch of old Coburn. Oh, Lordy, we ought to be complete. We ought to have them all. What does all mean? What years did Coburn make port? I'm guessing your listenership don't know. And we consulted various books.
Okay, so let me just... a lot of the listeners, and I think in general a lot of people, don't really know what is unique about vintage port.
Should I describe how it's made? Shall I take it from the top?
Well,
what do you want here?
Why couldn't you just get? What was so special? Why was that question? Let's get all those years. Well, why?
Let's start. Let's talk about an expensive. Let's talk about an expensive French wine, Chateau Mouton Rothschild, and it's very expensive because they had this cunning marketing plan that they would employ a living artist to do a sketch for the label that goes on the front. That means people want the whole set of them. They make wine every year. Sometimes it's a very expensive Bordeaux. It's properly expensive.
Like what, 500 a bottle or something like that?
Well, a 30-year-old Chateau Mouton Rothschild of their top wine, 4 figures. I don't know. So they make wine every year. If the sun shines, the grapes are really mature and ripe. It's fantastic. They make wine. If it buckets all year, the grapes are thin and dilute, they'll still squeeze out some wine somehow in order to put the label on it. Oddly, the rubbish years are more expensive because they make less of it, mm-hmm. and therefore people who want all the labels fight for the rubbish. typical French vineyard makes wine every year. This is not true of vintage port. They don't make vintage port every year. In many years, the grapes are just not up to scratch to make vintage port. It requires quite a lot of fussiness.
I read that it's like once every 3 years or something like that.
1 in 3 is a typical score.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, that's not untypical. The frequency's gone up a little in recent times for some vineyards because modern winemaking means they can do things like cool the fermentation. They can measure more precisely when grapes are ripe. So modern technology helps a bit. But it is still not every year. Will a vineyard declare, to use the term of art, a vintage or not? And in years in which everybody declares, it is called, wait for the imaginative terminology, a general declaration. So, which years did Coben declare a vintage? Oh, well, the books we had disagreed with each other, which didn't help very much. Damn. So
this was in preparation for this tasting.
This was in preparation for this tasting. So not long after, a friend of mine, the man who really took charge of organising that tasting, and I decided, we ought to put a list together. So we had the few obvious books that one would consult. This can't take more than a weekend.
So you were going to just bang it out in a weekend?
We were just going to make a list.
Just for Coburn?
Just for the obvious half dozen or dozen big shippers. Just go through the obvious 3 or 4 books.
Okay.
It was sort of probably a 2-bottle task. That is, a bottle drunk on Saturday evening, a bottle drunk on Sunday evening. And by the end of that, well, I say 2 bottles for me and 2 bottles for him. And by a miracle of modern communications, we could have done it. Actually, we ought to just check a few other places. Maybe we should go to Berry Brothers and ask if we can see their old price catalogues. That would be a good idea. Okay, we'll do that. Next time I was in London, we went there together and photographed their old price catalogue. Oh, lordy, there's a load of stuff in here that isn't in the other stuff.
Oh, really?
Yes. And when I say a load of stuff, I mean just declare for he declared this year and that year. Oh, lordy, I didn't know about this and I didn't know about that. So our ignorance outgrew our knowledge. That means you need more. When your ignorance grows faster than your knowledge, you need to start picking up the pace on gathering data. After about a year of the data gathering phase...
So what started as a weekend project...
Tell me about it.
Okay, fast forward a year.
After about a year of going around photographing records in places, cellar books, price catalogues, minutes of wine committees... This is the stuff.
So it's just one place led you to another sort of thing, kind of like...
Having gone to one place, I might as well go to another. I wasn't led there from the first place, but just making inquiries in places. Archivists loved me. And it's not just the dulcet tones that appeal to your listenership. If you are an archivist at one of the worshipful company of Salters, say, or any of these other ancient institutions... You get letter after letter, and they all say the same thing. My grandpa was a member of your worshipful company, and I'd like to know more about my grandpa. Please, do you have any information? Oh, I bloody hate these people.
Oh, really?
Oh, poor archivists. It's always the same. And the answer is always going to be, have you consulted the membership of the worshipful company of Tawny Port, published in 1983 by so-and-so? A copy will be available in your local library.
That's what your response was.
That is the response that they are going to give to the my grandpa was. So instead they get a request from somebody who is not asking about his grandpa.
Oh, right, okay.
They love me. Indeed, one of the livery companies, and I've forgotten which, said that no one has looked at these records probably since the war. They'd been thinking of throwing them away.
Oh my gosh, that's
right.
Who
reads the minutes of a wine committee as taken in 1870 when they're discussing which hocks to buy, which clarets to buy, and the committee tasted 1868 ports and decided to buy a pipe of this and a pipe of that? Who cares? Broadly, me and nobody else.
So you know, when you were... So this was in 2008 you started this.
2008, 9, 10 was the main day.
We were still living in New York, and I was pregnant with our second child, and you know, so I had pregnancy brain, and I didn't know what you were doing. I mean, I knew you loved to drink vintage port, or just any port, really. And we'll get to all the different types of port in a minute, but I just thought this is his hobby. I mean, this is his sport. You didn't really do skydiving or rock climbing or other crazy stuff that other men do, but you would just
on a scale from rock climbing, blonde mistresses, cocaine, or writing a book on vintage port.
this is probably the. Well,
a wife didn't do badly.
I just did like what a wife does, is just kind of like sort of observe and carry on. But actually thinking back now, I just really had no idea what you were doing. I didn't really know what you were getting yourself into. And then it wasn't really until we moved out of New York in 2009 when you were able to meet up with your co-author, who basically you guys inspired each other to start this whole crazy project together. That's when I started thinking, oh God, it actually was just an annoyance. It was just, oh God, because that's what you would work on all the time. Yeah, for me, it was this, I had no idea that you were going down this massive rabbit hole.
Nor had I. And it didn't help that it was about 2010-ish that the co-author got bored. I think just...
No, I think bored is the wrong term. I think he recognized
the scale of
magnitude,
the task.
And like any sane person, was just like...
He got put off by the scale of the task and the demands of real life and just drifted away from it.
So why did you... Most people, I think, would...
Stupidity.
Okay. But no, seriously, why... People were...
Stupidity.
Okay, so you're saying you're just
stupidity.
Stupid. Well, all right. Well, the thing is, I had to sit back and go through this. It was so tiring at times because it was quite boring, actually, for me as a wife. It was like, what's Julian doing? Oh, he's upstairs working on his port book. I think I've said that. I mean, the amount of times I've said that. He's working on his port book. He's working on his port book. It's just like, when in doubt, what is he doing? He's either taking a nap, he's on the crapper, or he's working on his port book. One of the three, really, on any given day, especially when you didn't have a job, or on the weekends.
Stupidity.
Okay, so carry on. So actually, this is a good point where you have to describe why vintage. Well, what's the difference between what are all the ports? Because the first time I had port was, sorry to say, it's before you, and I think it was a Fonseca. It's like $35, and at the time I was dating somebody who was like, let's try this. It was in a wine shop, and we just thought it was super posh, like port. And I really loved it. I just thought, this is really good. And it was a Fonseca. I'm almost sure of that.
Good brand.
And yeah, it's a good brand. It's still one of my favorites because I think that was my first experience.
It's a good brand.
And so, but when I met you, or when we were together and we got married, and it was this big thing about port, it was like, okay, great. He loves port. I like port too. It's actually good that I like port. But
arguably,
I didn't know...
It's bad. The decanter gets filled, and evil wifey nicks some. I mean, why is this good?
Listen, I couldn't drink more than a glass and a half of port, really, in any given night.
Well,
I mean, really,
if the glass was sufficiently big,
okay,
the same
maybe
would be
two,
true.
but 2 glasses,
If you go to the Sandeman Lodge in Gaia, they have a little museum there, and one of the directors of Sandeman had been told by his doctor who had been slightly shocked at the amount he drank. How much port do you drink? Oh, about 2 pipes a year. That's 3-ish bottles a day, which the doctor for some reason thought was excessive and restricted him to 1 glass per day. So he had a glass made.
Oh, God.
The glass is behind is in a cabinet, so I haven't measured it, but it looks like a 2-litre glass.
Oh my God, that's funny.
So he probably had a Magnum poured in at lunch, and that was his 1 glass of port per day. So
that's clever.
When you say you have 1.5 glasses a day, well, how long is a piece of string?
No, it's a very small glass. So What is the difference between... I was saying...
Should I take it from the top and tell them what port is in the first place?
Yes.
Right.
Please.
To make table wine, you pick some grapes, very important step, crush them, maybe using feet, maybe using something automatic, exposing the sugar. Yeast come in and go, ooh, we like sugar.
So they add the yeast.
Well, yeast, at harvest time, there's yeast in the air everywhere.
Okay.
You can't not add the yeast.
Right.
Because the neighbouring winery is producing yeast in massive scale. Mm-hmm. They blow around in the wind. You might add your own yeast, you might not. It doesn't matter. Yeast are there. They're coming in. They eat the sugar, excrete alcohol, and somewhere around the 14% mark, the sugar level goes down and the alcohol level gets high enough to kill the yeast. And the yeast that are left in the drink get killed. And there's plenty blowing away in the wind to go try and eat other fruits. Easy peasy. Port, again, start with grapes. Pick them a bit later so they're a bit sweeter. You want more concentration as well. To make really good port, you want very concentrated grapes. So not heavy with liquid, but smaller berries, but more juice and more flavour. Crush them, use feet or robotic feet as they now use. Again, yeast come in and eat the sugar and excrete alcohol.
What's the benefit of feet? Is it because of the unevenness of
if you use something too rough, you'll break the pips, and the pips contain very nasty, bitter flavours. So you want something that can break and mash up the skins, but will not break the pips.
Okay.
Right. The human foot is actually about the right softness for this, and works well. And with I'm a full-sized English male, shall we say? Don't comment, Mrs. W. But Portuguese males are shorter and thinner than me, so they might weigh 60 kilos, and 60 kilos on a Portuguese foot is excellent, but has become increasingly expensive as labour's gone up. So the robotic lagars are designed to reproduce the same softness and pressure to mash up the skin and release the colours and the flavours in the skin without damaging the pips. And good thought and technology has gone into making these, and they're good bits of kit. We're just slightly distracted. Fermentation's underway. When the fermentation's about half done, so about 6-7% alcohol, that's when you add the secret extra ingredient. With your right hand, reach behind your chair and produce a large quantity of highly distilled grape brandy. Very distilled. It's about 75% alcohol. And add about 1 part in 5 of this. So you've got 1 part in 5 of 75% alcohol, adds 15 percentage points of alcohol, and you've got 0.8 of about 6-7 percentage points of alcohol, is about another 5. You take the alcohol straight to 20% ABV. That kills the yeast dead. Mm-hmm. So the yeast have not eaten all the sugar, and you've added extra alcohol. Mm-hmm. It has extra alcohol and extra sugar. It is a big wine. Me like big wine, as we said earlier. Mm-hmm. Right. There's a number of things that can be done with it, depending on how good it is. And not just how good is perhaps unfair, it's nature, because the best Tawny Ports are not made in the best vintage port years. So good might be the wrong term there, though it's good as seen through a particular lens. If it is rich in fruit and tannin, and it can be so rich in fruit and tannin it's unpleasant to drink when young, put it in bottles, hide the bottles in a cellar, wait 30 years, and lo and behold, forth comes vintage port. Mm-hmm. Fabulous stuff. That is what my book is about. Sometimes they want something... There's a monetary problem with waiting 30 years. Customers don't want to buy things that they're not meant to drink for 30 years. And the port houses feel that locking away in a cellar and not getting your money in for 30 years has some financial cost. So they want to release other types of port as well. Late bottled vintage is near vintage in quality. It varies by house. Some of them are less near than others, and some are really quite near. And spends extra time in wood. Rather than just 18 months in wood after the harvest, they might spend 4, 5, 6 years in wood. And then release, you'll find them in the supermarket. They're often excellent value. Give them a good decant at lunchtime, drink in the evening, drink with pleasure. Very good value. Mm-hmm. Another thing they can do, which is, I think, even better than LBV, is a crusted. Mm-hmm. The regulations say that vintage port has to come from one vintage. It has to have a date on it. And all the grapes were picked in that year. So you've got bits left over. I've got extra Suzal from this year, it's a type of grape, and extra Tinto Roriche from the following year. And 2 years back we had too much Touriga Nacional. I've got that sitting in a barrel. Wouldn't it be nice to blend those into something that's very vintage-like? But I can't call it vintage because it comes from separate years. It will still throw a sediment, as does vintage port. It's called crusted because of the sediment. Crusteds are often splendid value. Sainsbury's has crusted from the Symingtons. A Graham crusted that you and I have drunk many times with pleasure. Again, decant at lunch, drink in the evening with pleasure. If you have a proper number of friends, decant more than one. They're very good value. I write a book on expensive vintage port, but I drink the crusteds, and I think they're very good. Very different product is Tawny, because that sits in a barrel, and barrels have some air at the top. It's exposed to oxygen its whole life. Vintage port disappears into a bottle with a cork and doesn't taste oxygen for 2-3 decades. Tawny spends the whole time being oxygenated. Sits in a barrel, exposed to oxygen. And they're bottled at 10 years or 20 years. They're actually of the right port for a restaurant. Because they've been exposed to oxygen the whole of their life, more exposure to oxygen doesn't do anything. So a half-empty bottle of Tawny can sit on a shelf for 6 months and nothing goes wrong with it.
And it's good.
It's good. I've tested that at a tasting. I found on my mother's drinks cabinet a half bottle of a Tawny Port that turned out to be from her second husband. Divorce had been 5 years prior to this conversation. And he'd bought it 5 years prior to the divorce. So it'd been half empty sitting with her drinks for 10 years. I swiped it and took it to a port tasting. along with a new bottle of the same. It was a Sandeman 10-year Tawny. So here's a Sandeman 10-year Tawny I'm opening now, and here's a Sandeman 10-year Tawny that's been on my mother's shelf for 10 years, half empty. Let's see whether the extra time on the shelf damages it. No, both were excellent.
Really?
Nothing wrong with either. So for a restaurant, it means you could open it, pour some, and you don't need to sell the whole thing tonight. You can wait days, weeks, months, and no harm comes to it. So it's a very good thing for restaurant or bar trade.
So what if we had a glass of Tawny, a glass of Crusted, a glass of LBV, late bottled vintage, and a glass of vintage all together in a blind tasting? Would you be able to tell the difference? Would you be able to pick out, without a doubt, or almost without a doubt, that's the vintage port?
Probably.
Really?
But it depends. Some of the LBVs and some of the Crusteds are excellent. Some of the Crusteds in particular are made to a vintage standard, but they're just not from a single year.
Okay, so they can't call it vintage.
They can't call it vintage, and that affects the selling price. And it's a very good way to mop up good quality leftovers, because you can make a blend out of, I've got some of this from this year and some of that from that year and this and bits and bobs. Actually, that lot would make I will use a bit of Tinto Roriche from this year. That would make a nice port.
I think, in my experience, I like Tawny's better than vintage port. What do you like vintage port better? Just that's your favorite thing. I mean, I'm assuming.
Yes, it is my favorite thing. But
why?
Well, should I buy some? Should I buy some of the large bottles of the Graham Tawny?
Yes, please. But why is it vintage port? Do you think that, so there's port enthusiasts and port aficionados and port geeks and port lovers that are going to be listening to this.
Like wine?
But what I'm saying is, so they're going to listen to, and surely they're going to say, I'm sure that they're going to say, oh, well, I prefer Crusted, or I prefer vintage.
Well, I like Crusted because I like vintage port, and Crusted is a low cost.
Okay, or I like Tawny, or I like.
Your question is, do you like it red and bottle aged, or do you like it yellower and wood aged? Do you like it wood aged? The wood aged makes it a bit sweeter. It can be more sherry like. Well, the answer to your listeners is quite simple. Because you go buy a couple and taste them.
Yeah, because you brought, every time you bring back a Tawny from something like a tasting, I think the last Tawny that you brought back was from the big fortified tasting event.
Well, hang on, that's a little unfair, because somebody gave me half a bottle of leftovers of something that was 90 years old, and the wife quite liked it. But But I'm sorry, love, €400 a bottle.
I'm just saying, I think in
lovely
my
to be given
experience...
it, but €400 a bottle. I mean...
Yes, we should have some of that all the time.
Right. Out of the shoe budget.
So, I think in my experience, I've liked Tawny's better.
I bought some batches of 20-year Tawny. Mm-hmm. They're often sold with an average age of 10 years or 20 years or 30 or 40. I might actually prefer the 20 in absolute terms to the 30s, and certainly in price adjusted. Mm-hmm. All houses make good 20-year Tawny. If you want to get into that, I'd suggest don't go and buy a bottle of 20-year Tawny. Go and buy 3 different ones from your wine merchant and have 3 glasses side by side and make a judgment call about which you like. Serve it chilled. You can open the bottle, have a glass, put the top stopper on, and wait weeks or months, and it's fine. Mm-hmm. For the retail trade, the Symingtons have latched onto a great plan of 4.5 litre bottles because they sit on a bar and look like something of substance. They are something of substance.
They're very impressive bottles.
4.5 litres is a decent amount of drinking for even
what
several
are they called?
people.
Imperials?
4.5 litres doesn't have a well-defined name. Jeroboam is a word used in some wine regions for either 4.5 or a 5 litre. It's not a well-defined term. An imperial is 8 litres. It's a 6-bottle bottle.
Oh, right, okay.
The 4.5s are only a 6-bottle bottle. But it sits on the... You will see one at fancy restaurants, and they're actually jolly good. Mm-hmm. And being a big and impressive bottle, they get emptied quickly. So
in a nice, like maybe a Michelin-starred restaurant, you probably would see more Tawnies than... Because if they have vintage port on there, they're going to sell it by the bottle.
Vintage port will be by the bottle.
Okay.
And actually what you should do, if you're going to do that in a swanky restaurant, is look at the wine list online, phone up in advance...
Have them decant it
3 hours early.
Got it.
That's the right thing to do. And that, for a restaurant, is a faffy business with a small number of customers who are that organised and that thoughtful and want to go through that hassle. Mm-hmm. So
I'm sure that
restaurants don't really like vintage port and typically don't sell a lot of it and don't choose to sell a lot of it. Whereas Tawny can be sold by the glass, sit on the bar, it's delicious. Mm-hmm. It's not the subject of the book.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that
we've drifted away from the book. I did want to sell the book a bit.
Yes.
Should I say a little about the book?
Okay, so why did you... So you spent 10 years...
It sounds like I built a list. It's not actually what I've built a list. I've not actually built just a list.
It does sound like you've built a list.
The starting point was which vintages were declared. So I need evidence. And in evidence are stories. There's little controversies. And when I found a story about vintage port, this is where it's hidden. I'll give you an example. Mm-hmm. In the 1930s, for the young Queen Mary, a doll's house was made. It's a working house at 1/12 scale. Mm-hmm. The plumbing works. The electric lights work.
The plumbing works?
The plumbing, yeah.
Oh, God.
Some of the finest craftsmen in the country were commissioned to do their bit.
For Queen Mary?
For the Royal Doll's House.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a Royal Doll's House. Stop mucking around.
So it was just... It was Elizabeth's sister. No. Who was it for?
Elizabeth's mother.
Elizabeth's mother. Okay, got it. Right.
No, it can't be Elizabeth's mother, because that's Elizabeth. I'm sorry, I've forgotten.
You don't remember who it was for?
I've forgotten.
It was well, isn't Mary? Oh no, it's Margaret. It doesn't matter. It was a royal dollhouse.
Yeah. And Francis Berry was commissioned to do the wine cellar of Berry Brothers and Rod.
Okay.
This is a bit of a problem. Have you ever seen a drop of water? Now think about a 1/12 size bottle. How are you going to get the drop inside the bottle? He had to de-sparkle the champagne to get it in.
Oh, right.
You just couldn't get the sparkle out of the champagne in those bottles.
They used real...
Every bottle had the real wine that it said on the label.
Oh, God.
The Royal Dolls, you're not going to stint them with fakes, are you? Right. And different sources say that the Coburn that went in was either 1851 or 1878. Which is it? Major controversy. I'm not expecting the government to fall over this particular matter. And so I wrote to the curator of the Royal Collection and asked for help. And she didn't know either. Most of the labels have fallen off.
Oh, really?
So nobody knows.
Did she check that? Like,
she sent me their formal list of what they have in the cellar, and some labels were on, and there's 90 odd bottles of unidentified port. So we don't know whether it was the 1878 or the 1851.
Oh, so it's this unknown.
Right. The obvious thing to do is that there's 24 of them, 1/12 size. There's not much. We're a bit short on supplies here. Mm-hmm. It's going to be, with a bit of squeezing, you might get a cubic 1 centilitre out. I mean, that's with a bit of squeezing.
It's not even a sip.
It's not even a sip. And I don't think there are many people alive who could reliably distinguish between an 1851 and an 1878, given a tiny, tiny, tiny quantity.
So it's unknowable. This is in the book.
It's in the book.
The story's in the book.
The story's in the book.
So when you discovered this...
Oh, I thought that's a nice little story to put in the Cobra chapter.
Okay.
Some of the stories are minor things. Minor for those who are not into port, about... when will the 27 be ready to drink? And various wine committees have pontificated over the years about when their 27's dow is drying out a bit, or whatever it was, in the 1950s. Well, I had some last year and it was still delicious. And it is interesting how these people tasting it 60 years ago thought we'd better hurry up with this. And 60 years later, it's still excellent. So for those who are into vintage port, or wine aficionados who, let's say, collect Rhone or collect claret, and should have the definitive reference book on other things when they become available, it's a great book. Mm-hmm. Port Vintages on portvintages.com. For a casual drinker, less so.
Right. I agree. I think looking through the book and now knowing so much about it, I think that wine aficionados, people who love wine and who collect wine and have a really nice cellar and have a few bottles of port themselves, I think it's a fantastic book for them to have in their collection.
Yes.
Yeah.
But if your version of drinking is 6 pints of snakebite and black...
snakebite and black.
Don't go there.
What?
Don't go there. Then just don't go there. I mean, this is not for you.
I've never heard of that. Snake... I'll have to Google it. Okay.
I married a woman of class and sophistication. She does not know of snakebite and black.
I don't know.
It's like that scene in The Importance of Being Earnest where Cecily's arguing with Gwendolen. When I see a spade, I call it a spade. I'm glad to say that I have never seen a spade. We obviously move in widely different social circles.
So it'll be really interesting, especially for people in the wine industry, such as sommeliers and restaurants and whatever. But so anybody who is listening who wants a copy of the book, how should they buy it?
I didn't... Start again. Wine reference books no longer sell. The big publishing companies have given up. I remember my father pulling a wine reference book off his shelf 25 years ago.
Right, because you can Google everything now.
But nowadays you pull a phone out of your pocket and you wouldn't go for Dead Tree. It's just not what people do. It's on Google. 1,000 wine experts and non-experts have posted their own tasting notes about stuff. There's so much information for free that publishers have understandably given up. Right. Some self-publishing it. How big should the print run be? 100? 2,000? I don't know. So solving this problem, it is available by pre-order. Mm-hmm. That will determine how many are printed. Makes it very easy. So if I get 10,000 orders, apart from falling off my chair, I'll print 10,000. And if I don't, I won't fall off the chair or print 10,000.
It's okay. If you fall off the chair, honey, I'll pick you up.
Ah, isn't she lovely? So those who want need to pre-order before the order goes to the printer on www.portvintages.com.
Yes.
No punctuation except for the dots at the beginning and the end of the obvious way.
Portvintages.com.
And if you don't order in time, you're not getting one. So hurry up. Do it now.
Okay, honey. Thank you for telling us about your book and port.
My pleasure, my love.
I actually think it's very interesting.
Maybe some of your readers...
I actually listened to the whole thing.
What? The wife listened to her husband? What?
I think it's very interesting. I think it's a very, very good accomplishment. I know you don't take compliments or anything like that, but I think you did a really good...
Maybe some of your listeners will write in to say your husband's fantastic, let's have him again.
Yes,
Others will write in to say he sounds awful, why did you marry him? I don't know. I hope you give me a good score.
Okay, there you have it, folks. Go to portvintages.com and buy 10 and then share it with your friends. Wasn't that a fun and interesting conversation with Julian? Well, if you're still listening, then you're probably a family member or a good friend or someone who really loves wine and port, which also means that you probably want a copy of Julian's book. So go on over to portvintages.com, portvintages.com, and buy your copy today. Our online store is only open for a limited time, so we can get the orders to the printers and they can ship the books out soon. If you thought this episode was entertaining and informative, I would really, really appreciate it if you share it so that more people can go over to portvintages.com to buy lots of copies. If you have a question, send us an email at sales@portvintages.com. We can give a nice discount for bulk orders of five copies and up. Just let us know how many and I'll arrange that for you. That's sales@portvintages.com. See you at the next episode where I'm chatting with a very cool woman who is a mother of 2 and living an expat life in Jakarta with her husband. Very fascinating story. Stay tuned for that coming soon. I'm Dr. Marianne Shiozawa. Thanks again for listening.